The world woke up to a seismic shift the old powers never imagined. Africa, once written off, underestimated, and economically sidelined, had surged past Europe so fast that global markets were left spinning. While Europe battled collapsing factories, energy shortages, and investor flight, Africa was pulling in billions, building new industries, and rewriting global trade rules from Nairobi to Johannesburg.
France's President Emmanuel Macron is in Beijing for a 3-day visit to China, where he's met with President Xi Jinping. The French president is aiming to attract more investment from Chinese companies and increase market access for European firms. Equally,
Europe is in a fight for a continent that is whole and at peace, for a free and independent Europe, a fight for our values and our democracies, a fight for our liberty and our ability to determine our destiny for ourselves.
The European Union facing an existential crisis. Right now, the bloc looks less like a global power and more like a political punchline, with France alone burning through 4 prime ministers and counting in a single year. But this chaos isn't random. It's the culmination of decades of decay, division, and economic mismanagement.
For the first time in modern history, Europe was no longer the center of global power. It was scrambling to catch up. And as African nations seized control of their minerals, rebuilt their economies, and united under a new continental strategy, a truth echoed across every capital in Europe: the world order had changed. And Africa was now driving it.
The discussion was the fact that, as we will have with the roadmap, a surge in defense expenditure, it is for us very important that these defense investments are an engine for growth. In other words, we want a return on investment. It's going to be billions and billions, actually 800 billion, up to 800 billion till 2030. And we want a very clear return on investment by creating jobs here in the European Union and having research and development here in the European Union. So Europe must be responsible for its own defense as a strong transatlantic security and fully aligned with NATO.
The headlines crashed across global markets like a tidal wave. Africa surges past Europe in growth for the first time in modern history. Investors pour in. For the old European power centers London, Paris, Berlin, Madrid, the news felt like an earthquake crumbling beneath foundations they once believed were unshakable. For decades, Europe had viewed itself as a permanent pillar of global industry and commerce, a hub of manufacturing, finance, and scientific advancement. But within 3 turbulent years, the world that once revolved around Europe was now rotating toward Africa. The shift was not gradual. It was a sudden geopolitical shock, one that many leaders privately admitted they had underestimated. Africa's rise was not just symbolic. It was economic, demographic, technological, strategic. And as Africa surged forward with continental alliances, mineral controls, agricultural reforms, energy independence, and a booming manufacturing base, Europe found itself grappling with the worst industrial decline in a century. Factories closed, markets shrank, supply chains broke, and in the midst of it all, Africa became the center of global investment. The transformation started with a simple but powerful decision after decades of exporting raw materials at low value. Multiple African regions moved in coordinated alignment to ban the export of unprocessed minerals. They would only export refined, value-added products. The announcement sent shockwaves through Europe, whose industries depended on a constant flow of cheap African raw materials: copper from Zambia, cobalt from the Democratic Republic of Congo, bauxite from Guinea, chrome and platinum from South Africa, manganese from Gabon, and dozens more. The European manufacturing model had been built on a hidden truth: affordability depended on Africa's underpriced resources. But that truth no longer existed. Africa's mineral ban strategy came alongside investment incentives for domestic processing plants. Foreign companies had to build factories on African soil if they wanted access to the resources. For the first time, Africa was not merely a supplier, it was becoming a producer. Europe didn't panic at first, at least not publicly. Officials assured their citizens that alternative suppliers would be found, new trade deals negotiated, and European innovation would fill the gaps. But the reality was harsher. Replacement markets didn't exist, new trade deals went nowhere, and European innovation could not manufacture cobalt out of thin air. The first industrial shock came from Germany, whose electric vehicle sector depended heavily on African minerals. German automakers reported massive delays in battery production. Stocks plummeted, tens of thousands of workers received suspension letters. Analysts warned that Europe's EV dreams might collapse altogether if Africa maintained its new economic stance. In France, panic erupted in the aerospace and nuclear sectors. The country relied on uranium from Niger, copper from Zambia, and titanium from Madagascar. African nations offered continued access, but only under new conditions that demanded local refining, higher revenue shares, and stricter environmental rules. For the first time in decades, France found itself negotiating from a position of weakness. Investors noticed, money began flowing out of Europe and directly into African manufacturing. Hubs Lagos, Nairobi, Addis Ababa, Johannesburg, Kigali, Accra. Global corporations began relocating factories to Africa, attracted by cheaper energy, lower labor costs, a young workforce, and abundant resources. Africa offered what Europe could no longer guarantee: stability, growth, and long-term economic opportunity. The turning point came when a major North American agricultural firm relocated 60% of its processing operations to West Africa. Overnight, supply chains began reorienting around African ports. European ports, once bustling gateways of global commerce, experienced record low traffic. The shipping downturn triggered thousands of layoffs from Spain to the Netherlands. The crisis deepened as Africa's digital economy exploded. New tech hubs emerged, fueled by satellite internet, African cloud infrastructure, and blockchain-based logistics systems that outperformed traditional European setups. Youth-led innovations created thousands of African startups that quickly scaled into global players. Meanwhile, European tech companies struggled with rising energy costs, aging populations, and lack of investment. Many began opening headquarters in Africa, creating an uncomfortable reality for European leaders. The continent they once lectured on development had become their best hope for growth. The political consequences in Europe were immediate. Public frustration swelled as unemployment rose. Manufacturing workers demanded answers. Opposition parties blamed leadership for failing to anticipate Africa's rise. Protests flared across industrial districts in Italy, France, and the UK, with thousands chanting for economic reform and renaissance. But those reforms required resources Europe no longer controlled. Africa held them, and Africa was no longer willing to give them away. At major global summits, African leaders spoke with confidence. Unseen in modern geopolitics, they presented a new vision, one where Africa was not a passive participant in the global order but a dominant economic force. Europe watched in disbelief as multinational corporations signed billion-dollar agreements with African blocs, bypassing European capitals entirely. The most dramatic sign of Europe's decline came when African sovereign wealth funds overtook several European investment houses. African capital began buying stakes in European factories, farms, and energy grids. The symbolism was undeniable. Roles had reversed. Africa was investing in Europe because Europe needed the money. Meanwhile, European industries reliant on African markets faced harsh retaliation. When Africa tightened regulations on agricultural imports to encourage local production, European farmers suffered devastating losses. Orchards in Spain rotted, dairy cooperatives in France declared bankruptcy. Wheat exports from Eastern Europe fell. By nearly half, the energy sector suffered next. Africa's renewable energy boom, particularly in solar-rich regions, created cheaper electricity than Europe could produce even with advanced infrastructure. Multinational energy companies shifted to Africa, drawn by abundant sunlight, wind corridors, and low-cost labor. European energy giants found themselves sidelined in a market they once dominated. The financial markets reflected the crisis. The value of major European stock indices plummeted while African markets surged to historic highs. Analysts declared this the first true power rotation of the 21st century, a shift where Europe was no longer the gravitational center of global wealth. The crisis reached its peak when Africa launched a unified trade network spanning East, West, Central, and Southern regions. The network slashed internal tariffs, created a common regulatory standard, and accelerated cross-border energy and digital connectivity. Europe watched as Africa formed the world's largest growth zone, a zone that investors described as the new engine of global prosperity. The transformation stunned Europe because of how quickly it happened, but African economists insisted this was not sudden, it was simply overdue. They argued that Africa's rise was the natural consequence of decades of underutilized potential and a global system that no longer reflected demographic or economic reality. Europe, with its aging population and shrinking workforce, simply could not keep pace. Meanwhile, Africa, the youngest continent, was entering its prime. Hundreds, of millions of youth, educated and connected, became the backbone of industries Europe failed to modernize. As Europe's industries fell one by one, automotive, steel, agriculture, aerospace, energy, the continent struggled to redefine its identity in a world that was no longer Eurocentric. And Africa surged forward with a confidence that electrified global markets. For the first time in modern history, Africa was leading the world's economic direction, and Europe found itself following. Europe entered a period of deep introspection, though many called it something harsher: denial. Leaders insisted the crisis was temporary, a passing storm rather than a structural collapse. Yet beneath the diplomatic optimism, private reports painted a different picture. Economists warned that Europe's industrial decline was accelerating, at a pace unseen since the post-war era, driven by the vacuum left as Africa withdrew from the low-value economic role it had long been pressured to occupy. In economic centers like Frankfurt, Milan, and Brussels, the mood shifted from concern to alarm. Analysts no longer asked if Africa's rise would reshape the global order, they asked how much farther Europe would fall. Africa now controlled vast mineral corridors essential to everything from EV batteries to aerospace components. The continent had transformed into the world's primary growth engine, and Europe was on the sidelines searching for answers. Trade negotiations increasingly ended with Africa setting terms and Europe accepting them. African leaders insisted on value-added agreements, technology sharing, and mandatory local processing. Europe could comply or walk away, there was no longer any middle ground, and with each agreement Africa secured, the global balance tilted. Further, while Europe wrestled with industrial stagnation, Africa launched new manufacturing districts powered by low-cost renewable energy and modernized logistics networks. Solar megaprojects in North and East Africa produced electricity at prices Europe could not match, even with subsidies. Wind corridors across West Africa generated surpluses sold to neighboring regions, reducing reliance on foreign grids. The cost advantage attracted global manufacturers who were previously anchored in Europe. They moved not out of sympathy or ideology, but because Africa was the logical choice. Europe's energy crisis deepened as African oil and gas-producing nations prioritized regional development and domestic industries instead of constant export flows. New African policies encouraged refining on African soil, keeping more value within the continent. European refineries, accustomed to stable African supply, faced disruptions and soaring costs. This ripple effect shook everything from transportation to chemical manufacturing. Markets reacted violently to each African policy update, evidence of how central the continent had become to global stability. Meanwhile, African sovereign wealth funds grew powerful enough to influence global markets. They began buying distressed European assets, ports, factories, energy companies, agricultural firms, often at bargain prices. These acquisitions were strategic, not symbolic. Africa was not only leading global growth, it was now investing directly into Europe's weakest sectors, reshaping ownership structures that had remained unchanged for decades. Europe resisted at first. Some politicians demanded new restrictions on African capital, arguing that strategic industries should remain under European control. But financial reality made the decision easy. Without African investment, entire sectors would collapse. So Europe opened the gates, willingly or not. In contrast, the African Union strengthened its continental economic framework, solidifying its position as a unified powerhouse. Trade barriers between African regions continued to fall. High-speed rail corridors expanded cross-border commerce. Digital payment networks bypassed traditional European banking systems, reducing Africa's dependence on external financial structures. New African institutions, continental banks, credit agencies, and investment authorities began replacing European systems that had once dominated global finance. Europe watched as Africa built an economic ecosystem that served African interests first. For the first time in modern history, Africa was not being shaped by external forces. Africa was shaping itself, and as Africa surged, Europe struggled under the weight of an economic model that had failed to evolve. Industries that once depended on low-cost African resources could not withstand the new reality of competition. Without affordable inputs, manufacturing slowed. Without manufacturing, exports fell. Without exports, currencies weakened. One by one, European economies entered recession. Public frustration reached a breaking point. Across major cities, demonstrations swelled with workers demanding new strategies, new leadership, new relations with Africa. Many argued that Europe had spent too long assuming its dominance was permanent. They believed Europe should have partnered with Africa as equals decades earlier instead of relying on unequal trade structures. But the past could not be rewritten. The present belonged to Africa. European companies scrambled to reinsert themselves into the African market, but they were now competing with global players who had embraced Africa's rise from the beginning. Asian, Middle Eastern, and Latin American investors had built strong relationships under the new African economic order, leaving Europe to fight for relevance. The more Europe struggled, the more investors looked to Africa as the future. This was the shift Europe never prepared for, a world where African success did not come at Europe. At expense, Europe fell because it failed to adapt, while Africa rose because it finally took control of its destiny. As Europe's crises deepened, Africa pushed forward with unprecedented confidence. The continent no longer viewed itself as emerging, it viewed itself as leading, and global markets agreed. Africa's demographic strength became the defining engine of global growth. Millions of skilled youth entered the workforce each year, powering advanced manufacturing, digital industries, and scientific innovation. Research centers flourished, universities expanded. African engineers developed new battery technologies. African scientists pioneered agricultural breakthroughs tailored to global climate challenges. African fintech systems became international blueprints. Investors described Africa as the world's last great economic frontier, but that phrase no longer fit. Africa was not a frontier. It was the center. Meanwhile, Europe found itself dependent on African imports for technologies it once produced. African-made batteries powered European vehicles. African-processed metals supplied European factories. African-owned shipping companies controlled routes Europe once dominated. Even European tech firms now licensed digital tools created by African developers. The reversal was complete. Conclusion: Europe's struggle and Africa's surge marked the most dramatic geopolitical shift of the 21st century. It was not merely an economic transition, it was the end of an era and the beginning of another. Africa rose because it changed how it viewed itself. Europe struggled because it refused to change how it viewed Africa. The imbalance that defined global trade for generations collapsed under its own weight. Africa reclaimed control of its resources, its markets, its future. Europe, caught unprepared, faced a reckoning that exposed decades of over-reliance and underinvestment. Yet the outcome was not a story of Africa replacing Europe, it was a story of Africa redefining global power dynamics entirely. By building from within, Africa forced the world to evolve. The world now looked to Africa for leadership, and Europe, humbled but aware, understood the new reality. Africa was not rising anymore. Africa had risen, and no global power past or present could afford to ignore that truth again.